The water was still running when Richard said it. I remember that detail because I've replayed it so many times since. The faucet hissing against the steel sink, steam fogging the window over the herb garden I'd planted the spring we moved in. I had a dish towel in my hand. I remember the weight of it, damp and warm. Richard was leaning against the counter with his phone in one hand, not even looking at me, like what he was about to say required no eye contact at all. "My mother comes before you," he said. "Always has." He said it the way you'd mention the weather, flat, final. Like a fact he assumed I already understood, and honestly, some quiet part of me did. But hearing it out loud, in my own kitchen, after 24 years, that was different. That was a door closing somewhere inside me I hadn't known was still open. I didn't cry. I want that on the record. I just turned off the faucet and folded the towel in half, then in half again, the way my mother taught me, and I said, "Okay." Nothing else. Just okay. Richard looked almost disappointed, like he'd been braced for a fight he didn't get. He had no idea what that single sentence was going to cost him. But to understand how we got to that kitchen, that towel, that faucet, you have to go back 6 months, to a Sunday dinner that seemed at the time like nothing. My name is Diane Whitfield. I'm 56 years old. I've been married to Richard for 24 years, and for 22 of those years, his mother, Eleanor, has occupied a strange permanent residence in the architecture of our marriage. Not living with us, not exactly, but never quite absent either. She had her own house 4 miles away, a modest brick colonial she refused every offer of help to maintain, and yet she had a key to ours. She had opinions about our thermostat settings. She had, on more than one occasion, rearranged my kitchen cabinets while I was at work, explaining afterward that the spices made more sense alphabetically. I used to think that was just Eleanor being Eleanor. Meddling, opinionated, a woman who'd raised 2 sons alone after her husband left and had never quite unclenched her grip on either of them. I told myself it was harmless. I told myself a lot of things. The Sunday dinner that started unraveling all of it was nothing special on its surface. Pot roast, the good tablecloth, our daughter Hannah home for the weekend from her apartment across town, tired from a work week she didn't want to talk about. Eleanor arrived 40 minutes early, as she always did, and let herself in the back door, as she always did, and began, immediately, commenting on the state of my kitchen counters. "You really should get these resealed, Diane. Richard's father always kept ours pristine." Richard's father, as far as I could tell from 24 years of stories, had been dead since before I met her son, and pristine about nothing. But I smiled. I said something about getting around to it. This was the choreography Eleanor and I had perfected over 2 decades. She needled, I absorbed. Richard existed somewhere in the middle distance, present but never quite present enough to intervene. Over dinner she turned her attention to my cooking. "The roast is a little dry, isn't it? I always found a little more butter does wonders. But then, I suppose everyone has their own way of doing things." She said it lightly, almost affectionately, the way you'd say something cruel to someone you'd decided long ago didn't deserve the dignity of being confronted directly. Hannah shot me a look across the table. A look that said, "Are you going to say something?" I didn't. I passed the potatoes instead. Richard laughed at something on his phone. That was the pattern, and I want you to understand it clearly, because it's the part of this story people always underestimate. It was never one loud, dramatic cruelty. It was never a single moment I could point to and say, that's when it started. It was Eleanor's small, precise erosions, delivered with a smile, and Richard's silence in response to them, a silence so consistent it had become its own kind of language. A silence that told me, more clearly than any words could have, where I actually ranked in his priorities. Not last, exactly, but never first. Never once first. I used to tell myself he simply didn't notice, that he'd grown up so accustomed to his mother's commentary that it no longer registered as commentary to him. It was just background noise, weather, the ambient hum of being Eleanor's son. I gave him that grace for years. I gave him that grace long past the point where it was reasonable to keep giving it. After dinner, while Richard walked his mother to her car, Hannah helped me clear the table. She was quiet for a moment, stacking plates with more force than necessary. "Mom," she said finally, "does it bother you? The way Grandma talks to you?" I told her it didn't. Not really. I told her Eleanor was just Eleanor. I said it so smoothly I almost believed it myself, and Hannah, God love her, let it go, because 27-year-olds have their own lives to worry about, and their mothers are supposed to be fine. I had built a very convincing case, over 2 decades, that I was fine. I didn't know it yet, standing in that kitchen with a stack of dirty plates and a daughter who loved me enough to ask that fine had an expiration date. I didn't know that in 6 months I would be standing at that same sink, dish towel in hand, hearing my husband say the quiet part out loud. I didn't know that his honesty, when it finally arrived, would be the single most useful thing he ever gave me. But some part of me, some old, tired, watchful part, had already started keeping score. The credit card statement arrived on a Tuesday, tucked between a coupon flyer and Hannah's forwarded mail, and I almost didn't open it at the kitchen table before Richard got home. I'm glad I did. Halfway down the second page, sandwiched between our usual grocery runs and the gas station on Route 9, was a charge from a jewelry store in the next county over. $840. I don't own a single piece of jewelry from that store. I've never even walked into it. I sat there for a long moment, coffee going cold, running through every possible explanation that didn't involve the one sitting right in front of me. A mistake. Fraud. Someone had cloned the card. I actually called the number on the back before I let myself consider the truth, and a bored customer service representative confirmed, cheerfully, that the purchase had been made in person, card present, PIN entered correctly. Richard came home at 6:30 smelling like the golf course, tie loosened, the particular loose-limbed satisfaction of a man who'd had a good day. I waited until he'd poured himself a glass of wine before I slid the statement across the counter. Do you know what this is? He glanced at it for maybe 2 seconds. Oh yeah, I picked up a little something for Mom's birthday. Early, you know how she gets if you're late. Eleanor's birthday was in April. This was October. 6 months early? I saw it, and I liked it for her, he said, already reaching past me for the remote, already treating the conversation as concluded. Don't make a thing out of it, Diane. Don't make a thing out of it. I'd hear some version of that sentence so many times over the coming months that I started to recognize it as a kind of punctuation, the period at the end of every conversation Richard wanted to end before it had properly started. It wasn't anger in his voice when he said it. That almost would have been easier. It was a mild, weary condescension, the tone you'd use on a child who kept asking why the sky was blue after you'd already explained it twice. I want to be honest about something here, because this isn't a story about a woman who saw the truth clearly from the beginning and marched confidently toward justice. I doubted myself. I stood in that kitchen turning the statement over in my hands, and I thought, maybe I'm making a thing out of it. Maybe $800 for the woman who raised him isn't so strange. Maybe I'm the problem, the small, jealous wife who can't share her husband with his own mother after 2 decades of marriage. That doubt didn't come from nowhere. It came from years of being told, gently and often, that my reactions were the excessive part of any equation involving Eleanor. Richard had a way of recalibrating reality so that whatever discomfort I expressed became the actual disturbance, larger and more inconvenient than whatever had caused it. It's a specific kind of erosion, being taught that your own perception is the thing that needs adjusting. I let it go. I told myself I'd let it go anyway, which is different from actually doing it. The number stayed lodged somewhere behind my sternum, small and persistent, like a splinter too shallow to dig out and too deep to ignore. 2 weeks later, I noticed the checking account balance was lower than it should have been. Not dramatically, just enough that a woman who'd managed this household's budget for 24 years would notice, the way you notice a picture frame hanging slightly crooked in a room you've walked through 10,000 times. I pulled up the online statement at 11 at night, Richard already asleep beside me, and I found a recurring transfer I didn't recognize. $300, monthly, going out on the 15th, made out to an account labeled only E. Whitfield. Eleanor's name is Eleanor Whitfield, same last name as ours. Obviously, she's Richard's mother, but I'd never seen this transfer before. I scrolled back. 6 months, then a year. It had been going out, quietly, consistently, for longer than I could immediately trace on my phone screen at 11 at night, with my heart doing something uncomfortable in my chest. I closed the laptop. I lay in the dark next to my sleeping husband, and I thought about all the times over the past year he'd sighed about tight finances, when Hannah needed help with a car repair, or when I'd suggested we finally redo the bathroom that had been circa 1998 since we bought the house. Things are tight right now, Diane. Let's wait. Things had apparently not been too tight to send his mother $300 a month, without mentioning it to me even once. I didn't confront him that night. This is the part of the story that surprises people when I tell it later: the waiting. I've come to understand that the waiting wasn't weakness. It was the first genuinely strategic decision I made in this entire ordeal, though I didn't have language for it yet. Some instinct, older than my conscious mind, told me that confronting Richard with a single transfer would get me a single explanation, smoothly delivered, probably reasonable sounding, and nothing would actually change. I needed to know how deep this went before I said a word, so I started paying attention in a different way. Not obsessively, not vindictively, at least not yet. Just carefully. I began keeping the household bills in a folder I labeled blandly insurance, knowing Richard would never open a folder with that name voluntarily. I started screenshotting statements before Richard's automatic bill pay could shift the numbers around. I told myself I was just being thorough. I was actually building something, though I wouldn't understand the shape of it for weeks. At dinner that Sunday, Eleanor mentioned, almost in passing, that she'd finally been able to get her roof repaired. "It's such a relief," she said, patting Richard's hand on the table, right in front of me, right in front of Hannah. "I don't know what I'd do without my boy." I looked at Richard. He didn't look at me. He looked instead quietly pleased with himself, a man basking in the warm, uncomplicated glow of being someone's hero, blissfully unaware that the woman across the table, the one who'd covered a decade of that roof's smaller repairs out of a joint account without ever once being thanked for it, was starting. Finally, to count, Eleanor announced she was moving in on a Thursday, over a phone call I only heard half of because Richard took it in the garage with the door shut, which itself told me something before a single word was confirmed. He came back inside afterward with the particular brightness of a man delivering news he expected to be well received. "Mom's going to stay with us for a while," he said. Opening the refrigerator like this was a minor logistical update. "Her knee's been bad. The stairs at her place are getting to be too much." "For how long?" "We'll see how it goes." "We'll see how it goes" was, I'd learned over 2 decades, Richard's phrase for arrangements with no defined end, arrangements that quietly calcified into permanence while everyone pretended they were temporary. I asked carefully where exactly Eleanor intended to stay, given that our house had 3 bedrooms: ours, Hannah's childhood room that had become a home office, and a small guest room that currently held my sewing machine and 11 years of fabric I kept meaning to donate. "Your sewing room, probably. It's got the most space." I want to describe what happened 3 days later with precision, because it's the moment I think about most when people ask when I finally decided. I came home from the grocery store to find Eleanor in what she had, until that morning called Diane's sewing room, standing over my machine with a tape measure, marking the wall in pencil. "I'm just seeing what will fit," she said, without turning around. "This closet is much too small as it is. I told Richard we might have to build out." She had my sewing machine, a gift from my mother, the one useful, beautiful thing I'd inherited from her, shoved into the corner, half covered with a bedsheet, like furniture waiting for the dump. I stood in the doorway of my own house holding a bag of groceries, and I felt something in my chest that I can only describe as the sound a rope makes right before it finally gives. I didn't say anything to Eleanor. I went to find Richard, who was in the den, watching golf, entirely undisturbed by the demolition currently being planned 20 feet away. "Your mother is measuring my sewing room for a build-out. It's not really being used for much else." "It's being used for my sewing machine, Richard. My mother's sewing machine." He sighed, that specific weary sigh, the punctuation mark, and set down the remote with the air of a man being unreasonably inconvenienced by having to have this conversation twice in 1 week. "Diane, she's my mother. She raised me by herself. She's getting older. Her knee is bad. And I'm not going to tell her no just because you're attached to a room you use twice a year." "I use it." "My mother comes before you," he said. "Always has." The water was running. I remember that. I'd turned on the faucet to rinse a mixing bowl right before I brought up the sewing room, and it was still going, hissing into the sink, steaming the window over my herb garden. I turned it off. I folded the dish towel in half, then in half again. "Okay," I said. He looked almost disappointed that I hadn't given him more to push against. I think in some strange way, Richard had been braced for a fight for weeks, bracing for the version of me that would scream, that would make the ugly scene his mother had spent 2 decades subtly predicting I'd eventually make, and when I simply folded a towel and said okay, he didn't know what to do with the silence that followed. Neither, honestly, did I. But mine was a different kind of silence than the one I'd been offering for 24 years. This one had a spine in it. I went upstairs that night after Richard fell asleep, and I didn't cry, and I didn't call my sister, and I didn't do any of the things I imagine people expect a woman to do after her husband tells her, plainly, where she ranks. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and I opened the banking app, and I started, methodically, going back through 18 months of statements, screenshotting every transfer to E. Whitfield, every unexplained withdrawal, every charge I hadn't authorized and hadn't been told about. I built a spreadsheet. I am not by nature a spreadsheet person. I became one that night out of pure necessity, the way you become a different kind of person the moment you understand that the version of yourself you'd been playing for 2 decades has stopped being useful. By 2 in the morning I had a column of numbers that made my hands unsteady when I finally closed the laptop. I hadn't found everything yet. I could feel that, the way you can feel there's more house behind a door you haven't opened. But I'd found enough to understand that this wasn't about a jewelry store charge or a roof repair or even a sewing room. This was a pattern, and patterns, I'd learned in 24 years of marriage, don't start. They're just finally noticed. I thought about calling my brother, a paralegal in Columbus who'd always had a clean, unsentimental read on financial situations. I thought about it and decided against it, not yet. I needed to know more before I brought anyone else into this, even someone I trusted. I went to bed at 3. Richard was asleep on his side, breathing evenly, a man entirely unaware that his wife had spent the last 5 hours quietly building a case against him at his own kitchen table. I lay there staring at the ceiling, and I thought about Hannah's question from months ago. Does it bother you, the way Grandma talks to you? And I thought, finally, honestly, for the first time in longer than I wanted to admit, yes, it had always bothered me. I had simply run out of reasons to keep pretending otherwise. I met with a fee-only financial advisor named Carol Reyes on a Wednesday I'd blocked off on my calendar as a dentist appointment, which felt absurd even as I typed it, a 56-year-old woman lying to her own husband about where she was spending an afternoon. Carol's office was above a pharmacy downtown, small and unglamorous, with a window unit rattling against the October chill. I liked her immediately because she didn't perform sympathy. She just pulled up a chair, pulled out a legal pad, and said, "Walk me through what you found." I spread 18 months of screenshots across her desk like evidence in a case I hadn't yet decided to file. Carol went through them line by line, tapping her pen against the recurring $300 transfers, circling the $800 jewelry charge, pausing longest on a withdrawal I'd almost missed myself. $1,200, cash, taken out the same week Hannah had called us, embarrassed, asking for help covering a car repair. Richard had told our daughter, gently, apologetically, that things were tight that month. "Do you know what date this cash withdrawal happened?" Carol asked. I looked, May 14th. "Your birthday's May 12th, isn't it?" I hadn't connected it until she said it out loud, and something about hearing someone else say it made it land differently than finding it myself ever had. 2 days after my birthday, a birthday Richard had marked with a card and dinner at the Italian place we'd been going to for years. Nothing extravagant. Nothing that suggested any particular financial strain. He'd pulled $1,200 in cash. I never saw where it went. I had theories. I didn't need to prove all of them. I needed to prove enough. Carol walked me through what she called the architecture of it, which is a phrase I've never forgotten. Not one dramatic theft, she explained, but a slow, sustained redirection small enough individually to explain away, but substantial enough in aggregate to constitute something the law would eventually have a much less forgiving name for, depending on how our state treated marital versus separate assets, and depending on whose name was actually on which account. Some of this is going to matter enormously if you ever decide to separate your finances, Carol said, and some of it might matter even if you don't. Either way, you need to understand what you're actually looking at before you decide anything. I told her I hadn't decided anything. That was true, in the sense that I hadn't yet said the word divorce out loud, not even to myself, not even in the privacy of my own skull at 3 in the morning. But some decision had already been made somewhere beneath conscious thought, the way your body decides to flinch before your mind catches up to the reason why. Carol recommended a family law attorney, a woman named Patricia Ostrowski, who specialized in cases involving what she delicately called asset dissipation, money quietly siphoned out of a marriage, before one party fully understood what was happening. I sat in my car in the parking lot outside Carol's office for a long time before I drove home. Running the number Patricia's office had given me over and over in my head like a phone number, I was afraid I'd forget before I had the courage to dial it. I didn't call that week. I want to be honest about the paralysis, because I think stories like this often skip past it too quickly, as though the moment of discovery leads directly and cleanly to the moment of action, with no messy, human hesitation in between. I had spreadsheets. I had screenshots. I had a financial advisor's carefully neutral concern, and a lawyer's phone number sitting in my wallet, like something radioactive. And still, for 11 days, I did nothing but continue making Richard's coffee in the morning and asking about his day and lying next to him at night, performing a marriage that I now understood, with total clarity, had been performing itself back at me for longer than I wanted to calculate. What finally moved me wasn't rage. It was Hannah. She called on a Sunday afternoon, sounding tired in the particular way that comes from being 27 and still learning that adulthood doesn't arrive with an instruction manual. Her transmission needed work. $1,100, a real hit for someone 3 years out of college. "I hate asking," she said, "but do you think Dad could?" "I'll send it," I said, "today." I hung up and I sat with that for a moment, and then I opened my own separate savings account. Modest, built slowly over years from a part-time bookkeeping job I'd kept mostly for myself, for the quiet dignity of having something that was undeniably mine, and I transferred $1,100 to my daughter without asking my husband for permission or explanation, for the first time in a marriage where every financial decision, however small, had always passed through some invisible committee I hadn't realized I'd been reporting to. That night, I called Patricia Ostrowski's office and scheduled a consultation. I told myself I was just gathering information. I told myself, right up until the moment I sat down across from Patricia's desk a week later, that I hadn't decided anything yet. But I'd started returning to something in myself I recognized from a long time before Richard, before Eleanor, before 24 years of small erosions delivered with a smile. A version of Diane who counted her own money, who trusted her own eyes, who didn't need anyone's permission to notice what was true. I didn't know it yet. Sitting in Patricia's office listening to her explain what equitable distribution meant in our state, that I already had in that spreadsheet on my laptop, most of what I would eventually need. I just didn't know yet how patient I was going to have to be before I used it. Patricia Ostrowski's advice was simple and, in its own way, ruthless. Keep living exactly as I had been. Don't change spending habits. Don't move money in ways that would look, in retrospect, like preparation. Don't say anything to Richard, to Eleanor, or even to Hannah, until the filing itself made secrecy unnecessary. "The worst thing you can do right now," Patricia said, "is tip your hand before your paperwork is airtight. People do that. They get one piece of leverage and they can't help themselves. They use it too early, out of anger, and then they spend the next year regretting it." So I became, for the better part of 8 weeks, an actress in my own home. I made Richard's coffee the way he liked it, dark with exactly 1 sugar. I asked about his golf scores. I sat across from him at dinner while he complained, with real irritation, that the contractor Eleanor wanted for her build-out was quoting 6 weeks out, and I nodded sympathetically, and inside my chest something had gone very still, and very cold and very clear, the way a lake looks right before the first freeze. Eleanor, in the meantime, had begun treating the sewing room as a foregone conquest. She brought over paint swatches. She asked me, without apparent irony, whether I thought a soft sage would suit her better than the beige Richard likes, as though I were a decorator she'd hired rather than the woman whose grandmother's sewing machine currently sat exiled under a bedsheet in the corner of what used to be my room. I said the sage was lovely. Hannah started noticing something was different about me before I said a word. She came by on a Tuesday evening, ostensibly to borrow a serving dish for a work potluck, and she lingered in the kitchen longer than the errand required, watching me with the particular scrutiny of a daughter who has decided her mother is hiding something and is trying to determine whether it's dangerous. "You've been weird lately," she said finally. "Quiet weird, not sad weird. Something else." "I'm fine, honey." That's what you said in October too, and in August, I didn't answer that directly. I asked about her transmission instead, and about work, and she let me change the subject, but I could see her filing the moment away. The way I'd filed away Eleanor's small cruelties for 2 decades, before I finally started keeping the actual ledger. I felt a flicker of guilt about that. about the possibility that I was teaching my daughter the same slow, patient silence that had cost me so many years of my own life. I told myself this was different. I told myself I was building toward something, not away from it. I hoped that was true. Meanwhile, Patricia's office quietly requested records I hadn't thought to gather myself. The deed to the house, which turned out to be titled jointly but purchased substantially with an inheritance from my mother 11 years earlier, a detail Patricia said mattered a great deal in our state's treatment of separate versus marital property, retirement account statements. The original loan documents from when we'd refinanced, which listed my income from the bookkeeping work as a contributing factor in our approval, a small dry fact that would turn out to matter more than I expected. Every transfer to E. Whitfield got a timestamp and a corresponding note in the file. Patricia was building. Every unexplained cash withdrawal got matched, where possible, to a corresponding excuse Richard had offered me at the time. A receipt, in effect, of every small lie stacked against every larger one. I hadn't set out to become a woman who kept this kind of record. I want to be honest that some nights, doing it, I felt less like I was protecting myself and more like I was grieving something, cataloging the evidence of a marriage's slow death the way you'd photograph water damage for an insurance claim, clinical and necessary and quietly devastating. Richard, through all of this, remained entirely unaware, which told its own story about how little attention he'd been paying to me even before any of this started. He was preoccupied with Eleanor's move-in timeline, with the contractor's schedule, with a mild dispute over whether the new closet organizer should be cedar or standard pine. He mentioned once, almost in passing, that I'd seemed distracted lately, and when I said I was just tired, he accepted it without follow-up, the same way he'd accepted every flattened, minimized version of my feelings for 24 years. I used to find that carelessness painful. By December I'd started finding it useful. The turning point, small but real, came 3 weeks before Christmas. I'd left my laptop open on the kitchen table. A genuine mistake, not a test, though I've wondered since whether some subconscious part of me wanted to be caught. And Hannah, stopping by to drop off a gift, glanced at the screen while I was in the pantry. When I came back, she was very still, staring at a spreadsheet with 18 months of transfers to her grandmother laid out in stark, undeniable rows. "Mom," she said quietly, "what is this?" I sat down across from her. I didn't lie, not this time. I told her everything, the jewelry charge, the monthly transfers, the cash withdrawal 2 days after my birthday, the lawyer, the plan I was building slowly and carefully, so it wouldn't collapse the moment someone pushed against it. Hannah was quiet for a long time. Then she said the thing that told me, more than any spreadsheet, that I'd made the right decision. "Does Dad know you know?" "No." "Good," she said. "Don't tell him yet." It was the first time in this entire ordeal that someone else had looked at what I'd built and told me, without hesitation, that it was solid. I hadn't realized how badly I needed to hear that until she said it. Eleanor called the family meeting for the second Sunday in January, framing it in the group text she sent to Richard, Hannah, and bizarrely, presumptuously, me as a chance to clear the air before things get tense about the move. She'd sensed something, I think, some shift in the household's weather that she couldn't name but didn't like. Eleanor had spent 2 decades reading rooms for signs of resistance, and some instinct in her, sharpened by years of practice, told her resistance was building somewhere close by. She chose neutral ground, her own dining room, which I understood immediately as a tactical decision. Eleanor liked to fight on territory where she controlled the china. I arrived with Patricia's file in a manila folder inside my tote bag, beneath a casserole dish I'd brought because old habits, even ones you're actively dismantling, don't disappear all at once. Richard sat at the head of the table beside his mother, looking mildly anxious in the way he always did before family gatherings that might require him to have an opinion. Hannah sat across from me, and when our eyes met briefly, she gave the smallest nod, a nod that said simply, "I'm here." Eleanor began, as I'd expected, with a speech. She talked about family, about sacrifice, about the particular loneliness of raising 2 boys alone after her husband left, about how she'd never asked anyone for anything she didn't need. She talked about respect, the word she always reached for when she wanted compliance dressed up as virtue. "I think there's been some tension," she said, looking directly at me, "and I'd like to understand where it's coming from so we can move forward as a family." I let her finish. I'd promised myself I would, and Patricia had told me the same thing. Weeks earlier, in a piece of advice I'd carried with me like a stone in my pocket, Let them build the whole house before you show them it's on fire. I appreciate you wanting to clear the air, I said, when she'd finished. My voice came out steadier than I expected. I'd like to clear some of it too. I opened the folder. I didn't raise my voice. I want that understood clearly, because I think people imagine confrontations like this one as loud, as dramatic, as some kind of courtroom theater with raised fists and shouted accusations. Mine wasn't that. I laid the first page on the table, a printed statement highlighting 18 months of monthly transfers to an account labeled E. Whitfield, and I said, "Richard, I found this in October." I wasn't sure at first what I was looking at, so I waited, and I looked more. Richard's face did something I'd never seen it do before. Not anger, not yet. Something closer to the particular blankness of a man watching a door he thought was locked, swing open on its own. I laid down the second page, the $800 jewelry charge, 6 months before Eleanor's birthday. The third, the $1,200 cash withdrawal, 2 days after mine. I explained each one plainly, without embellishment, the way Carol had taught me to read them. Dates, patterns, the quiet architecture of it. I mentioned the months Richard had told Hannah money was tight. I mentioned the sewing machine, not because it belonged in a legal argument, but because I wanted it said out loud, once in front of everyone at that table, that it had happened. Eleanor's face had gone rigid. This is absurd. This is my son being generous with his own mother. Since when is that a crime? It isn't a crime, I said. It's a choice. Richard's allowed to make it. What he isn't allowed to do is make it with money from an account I also earned, and then tell our daughter we couldn't afford to help her with a car repair the same month he handed you $1,200 in cash. Richard finally spoke, his voice tight. "Diane, you're twisting this into something it isn't. I filed for divorce 3 days ago," I said. "I'm not twisting anything. I'm telling you before the paperwork does." The table went silent in a way I'd never experienced in that dining room before. Not Eleanor's practiced, superior silence. Not Richard's absent, distracted silence, but a genuine, stunned quiet. The kind that happens when a story everyone thought they understood is revealed to have an entirely different ending than anyone had prepared for. Eleanor recovered first, predictably, reaching for outrage as a fallback. "You'd tear this family apart over money?" "No," I said. Richard tore it apart over money. I just finally opened my eyes to it. I looked at Richard directly for the first time since I'd opened the folder. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the papers on the table, at 18 months of his own carelessness laid out in black and white in front of his mother. And for the first time in 24 years, I watched my husband have absolutely nothing to say. Hannah reached over and took my hand under the table. She didn't say anything either. She didn't need to. I gathered the folder, thanked Eleanor for the meeting with a courtesy that surprised even me, and I stood up to leave. Richard called my name once as I reached the door, not angry, not pleading, just startled, a man realizing too late that the woman who'd spent 2 decades absorbing everything he handed her had quietly stopped. I didn't turn around. I'd said everything I needed to say, and for once in my marriage, that felt like enough. The divorce took 9 months to finalize, which surprised people who expected it to move faster once the meeting at Eleanor's dining room table became, in Hannah's words, the thing nobody in the family can stop talking about. Patricia had warned me it wouldn't be quick, and it wasn't. Richard's attorney contested the characterization of the transfers for weeks, arguing they were gifts, generosity, a son's prerogative. In the end, the paper trail did what paper trails do. It simply refused to lie. The judge awarded me the house outright, citing my mother's inheritance as the substantial source of the down payment, along with a larger share of the retirement accounts to offset 18 months of documented dissipation. It wasn't a fortune. It was fairness, finally, on paper, after 24 years of it existing nowhere else. I want to be honest about what the 9 months actually felt like, because I think stories like this one sometimes skip past the cost of getting here. There were nights I sat alone in the house, genuinely alone. Hannah back at her apartment, no dinner to make for anyone but myself, and I felt something closer to grief than triumph. 24 years doesn't dissolve cleanly just because the math finally proved you right. I missed sometimes the version of Richard from early in our marriage, the one who used to bring me coffee before I asked for it, before Eleanor's gravity had pulled him so far from center that I'd become the moon instead of the sun in his life. I let myself miss that. I didn't let it change my mind. Eleanor never spoke to me again after that Sunday, which I understood in its own way as the most honest thing she'd ever offered me. No more careful cruelties disguised as concern. No more performances of family warmth for an audience that no longer included me. Richard's relationship with Hannah grew strained for a while, the particular strain of a daughter recalibrating how she saw her father, and I never once pushed her toward reconciliation or away from it. That wasn't my repair to make. I'd spent enough of my life managing other people's comfort at the expense of my own clarity. Richard called me the following February, 13 months after the meeting, 4 months after the papers were finalized. I almost didn't answer. I'm glad I did, if only for the strange, clean closure of it. I've been meaning to call, he said. There was a flatness in his voice I didn't recognize. Not the easy, distracted confidence I'd lived with for 24 years, but something worn down, smaller. Eleanor's build-out, it turned out, had stalled indefinitely once the money that used to flow so easily in her direction dried up along with the marriage that had quietly funded it. Richard was living in a rental 2 towns over. He'd sold his half of the retirement accounts down faster than expected, covering legal fees and, from what Hannah had mentioned once in passing, covering Eleanor's mounting expenses now that he was her only remaining source of support. "I'm sorry," he said, "for all of it, the way I talked to you, the way I let her talk to you. I should have said something a long time ago." I stood in my kitchen, the same window over the herb garden, though I'd finally resealed the counters that fall, on my own schedule, with my own money. And I let the apology sit in the air for a moment before I answered. "I believe you're sorry," I said. "I don't think you're sorry about the same things I am." He didn't have a response to that. I didn't need him to. An apology, after everything's already been lost, doesn't undo the losing, Richard, I said. "I hope you find some peace." "I mean that, but I found mine already, and it didn't have anything to do with waiting for this call." We didn't argue. There wasn't anything left to argue about. He asked about Hannah. I told him she was doing well, and we hung up without either of us pretending the conversation had repaired something that had been broken for longer than either of us wanted to admit. Hannah comes by most Sunday mornings now, a new tradition we built out of the ashes of the old one. No pot roast, no performance, just coffee and the 2 of us at the kitchen table, sometimes talking, sometimes comfortably quiet. My sewing machine sits back in its room, uncovered, in regular use for the first time in years. I finished a quilt last month, the first one I'd started in over a decade. I think about the version of myself who folded that dish towel in half, then in half again, and said only okay while her husband told her, plainly, where she ranked. I don't think of her as weak. I think of her as a woman gathering the last of her patience for exactly the purpose it was meant to serve, not endurance in the end, but evidence. I spent 24 years believing that keeping the peace was the same thing as keeping myself. I know better now. Some mornings, sitting alone with my coffee before Hannah arrives, I catch myself almost missing the noise of a full house, Eleanor's opinions, Richard's golf scores, the particular chaos of a marriage that at least kept me from having to sit with my own thoughts for very long. Then I remember what that noise actually cost me, and the quiet feels, instead, like something I finally fully own. If you've ever folded your own feelings in half to keep someone else comfortable, I hope you find your own version of the ledger, the moment you stop absorbing and start, quietly, keeping score. It doesn't have to be loud to be real. Mine wasn't. It was just, finally, mine.